The Guns of the South by Harry Turtledove begins with Robert E. Lee being interrupted from administrative tasks by some very odd-sounding gunfire. He and several of his staff go to check it out and meet a strange foreign fellow who demonstrates a remarkable little rifle, a breech-loader with a ridiculous rate of fire and shockingly little smoke.
The AK-47 assault rifle, the preferred weapon of your enemy, and it makes a distinctive sound when fired at you, so remember it.
This fellow, Andres Rudy, claims he can supply 100,000 of them. Mr. Rudy, what do you call this rifle of yours? Is it a Rudy too? Most inventors name their products for themselves, do they not? No, it's not a Rudy. The big stranger unslung his rifle, held it in both hands as gently as if it were a baby. Give it its proper name, Major. It's an AK-47. I know some of the gun guys are poised to explain why that's wrong. I have a touch of the AK autism myself. Turtledove is not a Kalashnikov aficionado. He gets the manual of arms wrong in several points, several mentions of banana clips, but that's not really the point, so I can look past it. The general, of course, wants the rifles, but Robert E. Lee is nobody's fool and isn't going to blindly trust some strangely clad fellow dispensing guns in a field. He makes sure that a few rifles and some cartridges are sent to the Confederacy's best chemists and engineers for study and, with luck, reverse engineering. Rudy and his cohorts make good on their promise. Johnny Reb goes marching all the way to Washington, Abe Lincoln and Bobby Lee have a chat on the White House lawn, and the Confederate States of America gets to be a real country. End of Act 1. And the story starts to get real interesting, with threads about technological development paths and their effect on wider society, the challenges of a new nation trying to establish its own identity, the confluence of race, slavery, economics, and culture in the Confederate States, and more subtly, an examination of right-wing revolutionary movements that complements the critiques of leftist movements that I usually cover here, for example, in this video. These AKs are supplied by a group calling itself America Will Break, who are actually members of the Afrikaner resistance movement who traveled back from the year 2014. Why not go back to the start of the war, or go back to help Hitler, or give AKs to the Boers? I know that, General Lee. I wish we could have come sooner too, believe me. But our time machine travels back and forth exactly 150 years. No more, no less. So the story can happen. AWB more or less takes over the town of Rivington, North Carolina as their base of operations, and their goal in aiding the Confederacy is to nurture a white supremacist ally to assist apartheid-era South Africa in the future, giving it a partner instead of standing alone as a pariah on the world stage. The first thing we can take from this is how they approach the task. They ensconce themselves within an existing institution, the Confederate States in this case. They leverage their influence into more influence, growing until they're operating almost as a state within the state, until ultimately they try to install a national government amenable to their ends, first by trying to influence an election, and when that fails, through a coup. While left-wing revolutionaries tend toward tearing down existing institutions to replace them with some radical new thing, for example, the French and Bolshevik revolutions, their right-wing counterparts generally try to capture existing institutions through military coups or installing their people in key positions. Or put another way, while communists might smash your truck to make room for the magical unicorn they promise is coming, these guys just steal the truck. The mechanism for seizing power, the escalation curves, they're different models, and the men of America Will Break are absolutely in that mold. They're trying to take control of the Confederacy to serve their reactionary ideological ends, not transform it into something radically new. They're also a good example of what happens to people on the fringe of any identity-based political movement, right or left. Those terms are generally not very helpful, but they're what everybody uses. While the Confederacy undeniably has a central pillar of white supremacy, that's not all that it is. But that's how these time travelers approach it. They become extremely irate when slaves are treated too lax, and they have no regard for free blacks at all. They treat their own slaves with malice, not simply content with obedience, but using them as an outlet for redirected aggression. While the Confederates are racist among everything else they are, for the men of America Will Break, race is the thing that defines their entire worldview, and everything comes back to it. So to clarify this whole right and left thing in context of revolutionary movements, in this case, right or left don't refer to specific ideologies so much, they're just synonyms for conservative or radical, and not necessarily exclusive. So, for example, the 1991 coup attempt in the Soviet Union. The plotters were Communist Party hardliners, the most commie of the commies in government, which would seem to put them on the left. But the coup was launched in reaction to Gorbachev's reforms. It was fundamentally conservative, trying to stop change. It had all the marks of what I somewhat clumsily called a right-wing revolution, a seizure of established institutions to preserve a desired order, not trying to fundamentally change the existing system. Now, this book does a good job of portraying the Confederates as at odds with modern sensibilities. Slavery is accepted as normal and right, only white men can vote, but at the same time, they're also people. Only the men of AWB see the world mostly in terms of racial struggle. Like the modern-day Klan or various neo-Nazi groups, they're a distilled and concentrated remnant of an old order, and what's left is made up mostly of anger and resentment. And so there's a disconnect, played most directly between them and Robert E. Lee, who after the war runs to succeed Jefferson Davis as President of the Confederacy, and butts heads with America Will Break over several issues, though like the war itself, slavery being a central piece. And within that context, Lee is portrayed as the moderate voice, which is plausible. The real Robert E. Lee did call slavery a moral and political evil, but he also held to the paternalism of the time, saying such things as, "The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things." Which is messed up from our vantage point. But compared to America Will Break, he's the liberal pushing for gradual abolition on the grounds that slavery is already on its way out, and it's better to manage its end than let it fester until it explodes into a crisis. This triggers the time travelers who attempt to assassinate Lee at his inauguration and end up massacring a bunch of people when it turns into a gunfight, which in turn brings the full force of the Confederate Army down on them. So another way we could look at them is by drawing parallels with CIA activities here. Covert intervention in a nation's internal conflict to tilt things in favor of the preferred outcome, but in so doing provoking a counter-response resulting in the very thing the intervention was meant to prevent. Blowback, they call it. They went in with a very simplistic understanding of the politics and culture of the country they were interfering with, and they pushed their agenda so hard it galvanized the opposition to do something they probably would not have done on their own. Without the Richmond Massacre and the books in the AWB's secret room, no bill limiting slavery in any way would have had a prayer of getting through the Confederate Congress. In the aftermath of the murders and the revelations from the AWB sanctum, his legislation did have a chance, maybe even a good one. As often happens with those who would do evil, the Rivington men proved their own worst enemies. Leading to another interesting aspect to this story that I think most people miss, at least in discussions I've had about it. When the Confederates move on Rivington, that campaign is commanded by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you're familiar with that name at all, it's most likely as the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. In this story, of course, that never happens. He instead has a redemption arc, defeating the murderous racist thugs from the future. When people read this book now, a lot of them don't like this rehabilitating of Forrest and read a lot into it. I get it. Also, I'd be remiss to not mention the Fort Pillow Massacre, where after capturing the fort, Forrest's troops killed a couple hundred of the Union men, many of them black soldiers. He says they resisted after the surrender, but lots of folks say otherwise. Point being, he doesn't fit the good guy template. However, I think there's a narrative element here worth exploring. It makes Forrest fight the thing he would have become. America Will Break is a bunch of men who lost their country. Their fight ended in defeat and they became bitter and fixated on finding a way to reclaim what was lost. They embody the purest form of the reactionary impulse. They literally go back to the past in an attempt to freeze their preferred social order in place. They're the ones left behind by a changing world, similar to what happened in the South in the wake of the Confederate defeat. With the Klan being one example of a desperate and angry backlash to try and stop what was already done. So in this book, Forrest becomes a sort of avatar for the idea that history is written by the winners, and also suggests that in some cases, those who are most valiant in victory can also become the bitterest of cranks in defeat. And it poses the question, what would you do if everything you cared about and believed in was stripped away? It's a separate question from whether what you care about deserves to be destroyed. But the main impact of these time-traveling benefactors is technological. The rifles being the biggest immediate factor, but they also give Lee some nitroglycerin-based heart medication. They provide his army with MREs, and they bring a lot of electrical equipment into their strongholds, all of which the Confederates want to duplicate on their own, but can't quite manage. There's a scene of a post-war Confederate arsenal trying to manufacture their own AK clones, doing the PSA thing of reverse engineering the rifle without the technical data package. Just as good? Well, not quite. A copy of the AK-47 manufactured here at the Armory, sir. 2 copies, as a matter of fact. For one thing, try as I might, I have not come close to matching the metal that goes into the barrel of the originals. So far as I can tell, it is nearly indestructible, as makes no difference. The ones we turn out both foul more and are more difficult to clean than their prototypes. For another, both the rifles you see here are almost entirely handmade. Not only is production very slow on account of that, but parts from one weapon are not interchangeable with those of the other. But I always pictured it with an octagonal barrel and a case-hard receiver, kind of Old West style. And this is an example of a civilization that isn't quite at the level to produce what it's trying to make, but has enough knowledge to leap the gap in some places and work around it in others. Or put another way, could they make an AK in the 1860s? Yes, but only if they had one to copy, which comes up not only in terms of metallurgy and machining, but the design process. Generally speaking, a new type of weapon will have defects, which may in some cases be ameliorated through modifications made in the light of experience. The next defect I discover in this AK-47 will be the first. The gun works, sir, which is no small wonder in itself. I'm not going to go forgotten weapons here, but I can say with some experience that firearms design is an iterative process, and the first few stages have serious problems. The real history of the AK is a prime example. In the book, seeing something shows that it's possible and spurs industry to duplicate it. Smokeless powder and Lee's heart medicine together spur advances in chemistry. They even end up in possession of some computers. But there they hit the technological wall hard. You not only lack the technology you need, you lack the technology to make the technology you need, and likely a couple of more regressions before that too. Give me electricity and I'll show you how to use however many computers you've captured. You can do that until they break down. When they do, they're gone for good. And so it concludes in the only way it could, with the Confederacy in possession of technology that gives them a little jump start as a new nation, but not enough to become a huge industrial power. And Lee's legislation for gradual abolition of slavery passes, setting the stage for a new nation finding its way into a future where an economy based on plantation slavery just isn't viable anymore. Why then did we shed so much blood separating ourselves from Yankeedom? We might as well rejoin the United States as emancipate our slaves. I fear I cannot agree with you, Lee answered. We spent our blood to regain the privilege of settling our own affairs as we choose, rather than having such settlements enforced upon us by other sections of the U.S. which chose a way different from ours and which enjoyed a numerical preponderance over us. Which was really the heart of the issue. Even if the South had won the war, they would have still faced the pressures of an industrializing world. The only real options would have been to phase out slavery in favor of more efficient production methods and a more diversified economic base, or try to double down, expand slavery into manufacturing, and become a sort of Drake-a-lite, which I don't think they'd have been able to manage for reasons ranging from disapproval from trade partners to the planter class relying heavily on paternalist religiously fortified justifications to simple numbers. And related to this what-if is the lost cause. After the war, the South quickly built up a mythos of how they were overcome not because they were beaten in battle or that divine providence saw fit to grant their enemy victory, but because of betrayals and mechanization. If it weren't for all your factories churning out guns, weren't for all those immigrant conscripts and blockades and foreign powers refusing to recognize the Confederacy, If it weren't for all that, we would have whooped you, Yankees. And we see the seed of another lost cause myth forming in the book when Lee and Grant meet in Washington after Lee's army took the city. Grant's pale blue eyes met and held his. All at once, he realized how much the federal commander still ached to fight. Had it not been for your repeaters, General Lee, I maintain we should have been treading on the streets of Richmond rather than here. The book presents a what-if that, while wildly implausible, gets to some key truths through its tale told through the eyes of regular soldiers and heads of state, all of them Confederates, all of them, when the war is over, having to build new lives in a new nation. It's a process that raises a lot of hard questions. And because the book was published in 1992, it's a bit of a cultural artifact itself. The dialogue, almost all of it between Confederates in the 1860s, is peppered with racial slurs, to the point that the book probably wouldn't be published today without an editor really reining it in for fear of provoking outrage and cancel mobs that read the words and miss the point of why they're there. In its own time, Guns of the South wasn't a huge mainstream success, but it was big in its genre and it got positive reviews. Civil War historian James McPherson of Princeton University described it as not simply great entertainment, it is also a serious and successful effort to come to grips with the central issues of the war. It is must-reading for every Civil War student. That's no small praise for a silly time travel novel. The Guns of the South makes us think about the complexity of the war and the mix of issues at its core, not by apologizing for slavery, but by trying to show us the Confederacy from inside and from varied perspectives. A president, a general, a sergeant, and a whore all have very different perspectives on the society they live in. By bouncing between them, Guns of the South tries, and at least partially succeeds, in capturing a more nuanced view than a straight historical text can manage. The old gray coat is plenty warm, but my fingers are freezing.